Let's go.
Do you want something to drink?
Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Stuart DeCue. I'm the program director at the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, a joint initiative between the School of Management and the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. We're thrilled to welcome students from across the university, as well as a number of members from the New Haven community to the talk today. Also, hello and welcome to everyone online. Hope you enjoy the broadcast and look forward to hearing any questions that you have coming into our Twitter account or onto the YouTube link. Today's talk is designed to thrive, social and ecological urbanism with purpose. Thrilled today on a number of components. First, to be co-hosting this with the Hickson Center for Urban Ecology. Does everyone know Anna Pickett right there? If you don't know Anna Pickett, go meet Anna Pickett. She is a wonderful human being who works at the center and at the Urban Resources Initiative and can connect you to lots of resources internally in New Haven about how to get involved in the community here. Also thrilled that as a joint initiative between FES and SOM, we've had a number of discussions and talks amongst students between both schools today, as well as students from across the university. And one of our guests is an alum of the Yale College, and we're thrilled to have a wonderful professor from Yale College who will be moderating today's talk, Laura Barraclough. And Laura is an assistant professor of American Studies, and she focuses on ethnicity, race, and migration. And she conducts research on American cities, race, class, and immigration. She's the author of Making of San Fernando Valley, Rural Landscapes, Urban Development, White Privilege, and the co-author of A People's Guide to Los Angeles. She also has an incredibly lovely 5-year-old named Alessandro who went to daycare with my 5-year-old, and they were really good friends for 3 years. And it's just a pleasure to have Laura here facilitating this talk, both personally and professionally. So I will pass it over to Laura to guide us through today's discussion.
Thank you, Stu. Thank you all for being here. I am so delighted to participate in this conversation, which I think brings many of us together around our shared interests, both in thinking big about what our future cities must look like, but also the practical skills and tools and resources that we need to achieve those visions. And so our conversation today will really be focused on this nexus between vision and practice and how we constantly learn through those dual processes in an iterative way. So we'll be focusing our conversation here with two people who I'm so delighted, again, to meet. First, all the way on my far left is Jonathan Rose, who I know many of you have been meeting with throughout the day. I think Jonathan has emerged as a national leader around the creation of green, affordable, sustainable housing, and beyond that, around a systems framework for thinking in more complex ways about our cities. He's the founder and president of Jonathan Rose Companies, which he founded in 1989, and has emerged as a leader in this field. The firm's innovative development, planning, investment, and owners' representation work, I think it's distinctive because of its work in all of these areas, has won awards from a wide range of notable organizations, including the Urban Land Institute, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the National Resources Defense Council, the American Planning Association, and the American Institute of Architects, among others. So he's the author of this fairly new book. It just came out last fall, The Well-Tempered City, What Modern Science, Ancient Civilizations, and Human Nature Teach Us About the Future of Urban Life. I know some of you have read at least parts of this book, and I encourage you to read all of it. It's really a wonderful read. He's here to talk about the thesis and arguments of that book and to help us think through what it actually looks like and feels like to create the resilient and healthy cities that we need to survive and thrive. And joining us also to share his wealth of experiences on this topic is Tom Murphy, who served for more than 10 years in the Pennsylvania State Legislature and was also elected mayor of Pittsburgh, a position that he held from 1994 to 2006. And many of his accomplishments during that time period created the iconic cultural and built landscapes that so many of us associate with Pittsburgh to this day, and that were really responsible for revitalizing the central urban core of Pittsburgh, such as Heinz Field, PNC Park, and the new David L. Lawrence Convention Center. Many of these projects are notable for their commitment to sustainability and have won awards and certifications in that area. And yet one of the things that he can help us understand today is to think through what are the many design challenges, but also the fiscal challenges and the political challenges of what does it actually take to create these kinds of projects and what are the challenges on the ground. Murphy is currently the Senior Resident Fellow for Urban Development at the Urban Land Institute, where he's consulting to a wide range of cities, both in the US and globally, and also is writing on some of the topics that he'll address today. So thank you all again for joining us. We'll talk, I think I'll moderate a conversation for 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to your questions in the audience. And Jonathan, we of course are going to start with your summary of the book, if you don't mind. Some people in the room have read portions of it, but we'd love for you to give us the 3 to 4 minute version, a high-level summary of this book, The Well-Tempered City. And maybe you could start by telling us, what is a well-tempered city? What are the key qualities and characteristics?
So, very brief summary.
3 to 4 minutes, I'll be timing you.
So first, just the idea of temperament is actually a musical idea, and it is a tuning system that is one that allowed scales that have been, keys that have been tuned separately before temperament to be integrated. And it is a system that Bach used to create an amazing piece of music called the Well-Tempered Clavier, which, and Bach had a deeply spiritual goal. He was a deeply religious man, and he wanted to reflect the extraordinary architecture of the universe in music. But and it took this integration for him to be able to do that. And it also took a new technology, which was the clavier, the forerunner of the piano. And so this is a theme that we need to find, integrate, that we as a civilization currently separate things in the way we fund things, the way we think about them, our politics, et cetera. We need to integrate them all because, in fact, the very nature of nature is vast and integrated. The world evolves in an interdependent way. And so we need to evolve systems that do that to imagine our, to manage our cities. Just a couple other points, and the first one is that we have a series of issues that we are facing. So one is globalization, another is climate change, another is population growth. The world's population is currently 7 billion people. It's moving to 10 billion people. That population is becoming more prosperous, and as a consequence, it is over-consuming. So we way out-consume the generative capacity of the earth. And we are seeing vast increases in income inequality. And every one of those conditions is a potential condition of collapse. And so if you believe in, if you want to see a better well-being and future for humanity, these are issues we have to solve. It turns out that cities are the place where the solutions are both emerging and are most likely to emerge. And I'd love to hear Tom talk much more about the political leadership, what you can do and can't do in a city, but it's much easier to do them in cities than in countries. Mm-hmm. So they are the leverage points for us to see innovation emerge. And so then the book says, so how do we create tempered cities? And well-tempered cities have two overarching characteristics. And the first is that they balance humans and nature. And the second one is that they create landscapes of equal opportunity for all. And if you look at maps of America today where we see people either coded by zip code or by county, we see that America is enormously unequal in terms of educational outcomes, health outcomes, many of the other well-being outcomes, the outcomes of opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Can you say a bit more about why cities? And you mentioned that there's a practical element to this. It's easier to do this in cities than in nations, but.
So cities are the realm in which mayors have to actually be mayors and city councils, and they're organized in a way in which you actually have to really deliver the goods every day. And if you succeed, you can actually, within the term of a mayorship or two, I think you can feel the results. And if you fail, you can also feel the results. That as I said, these enormous trends of globalization and climate change are hitting every city, but every city is being affected differently, and every city, if it has a clear vision, has the capacity to choose a path for how it's going to respond to them.
Mm-hmm. The theme of vision comes through again and again in the book. I'd actually love to hear from both of you, whoever wants to chime in on this one. How is it that we, who are in positions of political leadership in a city, develop a singular vision, or is that even the right idea to develop a singular vision? That was the sense I got from the book.
So what we need is actually a whole vision. So if you take, I have not yet met a city. I've been to 25 cities on my book tour, and I know a lot of other cities. I've not yet found a city that has articulated a vision that rises to the challenges in front of it, that says, how are we going to really defend ourselves against climate change? How are we really going to deal with our future population growth or decline? How are we really dealing with income inequality? How are we really dealing with our affordable housing gap? How are we really dealing with our rising healthcare costs? And if you project all these out in 2050. So I think it's a combination of vision, thus the data that accompanies the vision that both defines the vision and helps a city track its evolution towards the solutions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Can we hear from you?
Yeah, I mean, to follow up with what Jonathan, and I would agree with him entirely, is that the challenge for cities is that, too, really, is that you get lost in today. The challenges of today in running a city are overwhelming. Kids are shooting each other. You got snow on the road. You got to fix potholes. You have water and sewer problems that you might need to deal with, and a host of other things. And so you can spend all your time and all your energy on today. But the challenge is for a leader is to think about the future. And so the idea of how do you take resources and energy and invest it in the future. That means you'd face decisions. That sounds like it's something that everybody ought to do. But if I say to you, do you want more police, or do you want to take $6 million out of your budget and invest it in old industrial property to try to create value in it, what do you think people will want?
Police.
They'll want more police. And so that becomes a very controversial decision. Of how the use of resources, limited resources, okay. You have, as a mayor also, and I happen to think Jonathan is correct, the overwhelming amount of economic activity in America is happening in cities. It continues to be, flawed as it is, a place of opportunity for a lot of people. And so the other piece of this challenge is one, thinking about just today and not the future. The other is really the challenge of being intentional about the kind of city you want. And most mayors I meet, and this is, I think Jonathan touches on this, are transactional. They're not, so a developer taking the real estate, Jonathan shows up and says, I have an option on this property and I want to build some affordable housing. The city's structure, and often the mayor, are geared to looking at that transaction, isolated from the whole conversation about strategically, how does it fit into your vision? And so your zoning, and where we teach in planning, your zoning and comprehensive plan really focuses on a series of transactions, not on a vision. And that vision is not only real estate, but it is how do people connect into the jobs that might be created in that transaction, and how do people get trained for that kind of jobs? And so there's all these pieces that are disconnected in a city. So part of it is thinking about the future, and part of it is being strategic. I would say there needs to be a growing up in the room. In effect, okay? And now that could be the benevolent dictator, but there needs to be a growing up in the room who has the vision that understands these are the values that this community wants. It's the values that Jonathan outlines, right? It's about compassion, and it's about everybody succeeding, and how do we all are connected. That's a value structure. Could be the use of property. In Pittsburgh, we had no access to our riverfronts, and that became a value. We wanted a continuous riverfront park in Pittsburgh. And that should be driving decisions. So when a developer comes and says, I want to build on that waterfront, we would say, no, we're going to have a park there. And you need to be prepared to say, the developer says, I'm moving to someplace else, then we'd say, we really want you to be here, but there's going to be a park there. They're the value structure that cities often give away in the short term.
Beyond the transactional approach, why do we repeatedly give this away, this opportunity to hold tight to a vision?
First, you have to have the vision.
Well,
Yeah,
right.
that's the first question. That's the first thing. Right.
I guess I'm interested in this issue of who's ending up as mayors. Where are they being trained? Is it something about the way that
Nobody's being trained to be mayor.
Well, as an educator, I'm thinking about our educational systems and who, is this, I'm just thinking, again, in a systems framework about the pipeline of how people get into these leadership positions, who ends up there, who doesn't, and how that might play into the kinds of leadership we see.
That question raises the famous statement about there are two things in the world you should never see made.
I don't know this.
Sausages and laws. Okay? And that is also true about how people get elected, okay? Yeah, right. You don't want to know.
Okay.
Really, okay.
All right.
It's not pretty.
Wait, but, no, I actually want to counter this and say that most countries in the world have one university that is the one from which political leadership comes from. It's where the social networks of political leadership are built and the basic economics. So I was actually involved with a very interesting program that went to Southeast Asia and Thailand and Cambodia. All these countries had that one university. And all they did was they made sure that each country had a required undergraduate course in biodiversity. And then that meant that all these future political, you knew that some % of those people were going to be future political leaders, and then they'd all been trained in biodiversity. So we can think, and Yale, for example, trains leaders. We know that it's a school that has a high propensity of leadership to come out of it. So we can think about what is a core leadership development program.
I think about this example of a required biodiversity course as an example of what you write about in the book as leverage points, of being able to identify places where, I have an exact quote here somewhere, but to identify where a small change could make a big change in everything else. And so this sounds like an example of that. I would love to hear other examples, maybe from your experience or that you know of from other cities around the world.
I mentioned this at lunch, and some of you were there. I think one of the really remarkable grassroots movements in America was the Rails to Trails movement. And why I say that, there was no national organization. This is thousands of organizations from communities all over America where there were abandoned railroad right-of-ways that people it must have been in the water or there. People spontaneously got ideas that we ought to keep this for a trail. And out of that grew the Rails to Trails Conservancy, but at the time, it was, was in Nebraska and New Mexico and in Pennsylvania, people came together to say, we want to save this. And in many cases, the political establishments saw it as a problem, not as an opportunity. More and more recently, this becomes seen as opportunities. And so you had a movement, and it was a leverage point that we had this abandonment, and we want to turn it into a recreational and in some places a wildlife preserve and it was driven by groups of citizens taking power and an idea and very intentionally making it happen. And that would be an example, really one of many examples I've seen around the country. Okay.
There was a great mayor, one of America's great mayors, is named Joe Riley, retired at Charleston, South Carolina. And he came to understand the power of design in transforming his city. And is it called the Mayor's Design Institute?
Right.
He created.
I went to it. Every mayor goes to it.
That many mayors go to, and it teaches mayors about what is urban design and how to make a city. And design, by the way, is only one aspect of planning a city. This is really important to understand because we've gone through many phases where people thought it's only about the infrastructure, it's only about this, or it's only about that. It's only about everything, in fact. But the design is deeply influential, and having mayors actually understand that matters. When I went to planning school in the 70s, we were not taught about vision, really, and I felt being trained to be bureaucrats. This is one of the interesting consequences I believe, actually a negative consequence of Jane Jacobs, who is beloved in the planning world, but she's so espoused community-based planning that would, and then we add on that a whole series of environmental laws that came out of NEPA, et cetera. And planners are so embedded in the transactional that you described. They're so burdened by all this stuff they have to process. There's very little taught in planning school, or very little that planners in their role imagine as the visionary for their cities. So that's another leverage point I'd love to see unleashed.
I want to follow up a little bit, because how many of you are involved with planning in one way or the other? So I mean, my view, and I said this to my planning director, you're the keeper of the future. You need to be prepared to put your job at risk. But planning departments are, as Jonathan said, so often a bureaucratic agency where you get complaints about, and it's not about zoning and not about comprehensive plan. It's about the planning department understanding the intrinsic values of that community and what have to be protected. And we spend very little time on that. I think in how we educate people, and it's really the idea of being willing to be leaders for the really values that are going to make that community unique, and understanding them and how do you protect them, and being able to say to your mayor, that's not the right decision, that we shouldn't do that. Okay, that's really the important role that a planning department should have, and we've not elevated planning departments in most cities to that level.
So I also propose that cities have a vision, turn the vision into metrics, then we can track. So there's amazing things called community health indicators. Have people looked at these? They're primarily in the public health field, but you can have hundreds of them. And for example, Santa Monica has one of the Bloomberg Foundation actually did a competition for the best, and they came out ahead. But you can measure things like, so not only vehicle miles traveled, amount of pollution, was there enough affordable housing, and the quality of the jobs, and the quality of the schools, and you can get granular as in the number of students graduating high school with so many advanced placement classes, and then percentage of population that votes in off presidential election year elections as a sign of civic engagement. And you can have hundreds of indicators. So we can have a vision, we can actually articulate that vision through all of these indicators, and then we can actually measure. We have so much incredible data now, big data, small data, private and public, and we can now actually begin to use that to actually measure our progress. So I believe in a much more dynamic, continuous planning process in which and also, instead of using environmental impact statements, which I think is a very outdated and frustrating and useless process, we can actually use a much more dynamic scenario planning and evaluation system to actually be looking at the real impacts that are being generated by not only real estate development, but education outcomes, all the things that are happening in the cities, and use these to guide the co-evolution of all these functions within the city towards our stated goals of well-being.
Are there cities that are doing this in a really successful way that either of you know of, that are using data in the kind of way that you're talking about?
I'm thinking it's just really beginning. I think there are cities that are doing some of what we're talking about. I mean, the health indicators, the education, but I don't know that people put it together into sort of the bigger picture, okay? I think in terms of particularly education, there's a lot of focus on which schools are, I mean, it's both a national and state as well as local, which schools are doing well, which aren't, why, and trying to figure out. I think that really one of the real breakthrough opportunities will be around health, of looking at, as you get into the data that Jonathan was just talking about, of understanding the environmental impacts in a city. If you look at the health outcomes citywide, it will really mask maybe certain neighborhoods that have bad health or high levels of asthma or something because of what's going on, or a legacy of pollution that was there, right? So I think that as that data gets refined, I think that becomes a really powerful tool in conversation and change.
I agree with Tom, and health is where the money is.
Yeah.
It's the biggest chunk of the budget, and so I think that's actually where you're going to begin to see the biggest drive is reducing health costs. The problem is these are a long time in coming. So, for example, there's been recent studies in Science and Nature that show that the PM 2.5, so these are the particles that are under 2.5 microns that are in air pollution, actually lead to increased Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative diseases and many other diseases too. So there's an enormous benefit to economic benefit on the health side to society in reducing these, but the payoff is in decades. So we have to figure out how to present.
So let me give you a real world example. In a neighborhood of Pittsburgh called Lawrenceville, which is a city neighborhood turning around, becoming gentrified, there is a classic forging company doing forging the old-fashioned way. And they build a sand mold, and they pour stuff on the floor. And it employs 600 people. A third of them are convicted convicts who have been given an opportunity by this company because the company is in it. They are polluting. There's fumes coming from this. In the neighborhoods, as it's gentrified, the old neighborhood, we're happy that the jobs were there. The neighborhood that's now gentrifying says we got to close that plant down because it's polluting, and we're having to breathe that air. And so that's a real life. There are very few manufacturing jobs where I don't need a high school education even. In this company, if it moves to Texas or someplace where there's less fuss. So what is your choice?
So what would you say?
Well, I would punt for a moment. I would say, well, I would work with a company to figure out if we could help finance with them pollution controls. And if worse came to worse, I would protect the jobs.
You would?
I would.
And if worse came to worse, I protect the people.
I understand that.
Because
But I'm also protecting 600 people that are making a paycheck.
no, I got that.
And that's the trade-off, okay?
And see, to me, so here's what's interesting, is what principles do, they force you, what you want to do is force through the innovation barrier. So as long as we say, I need to protect the jobs, and it's impossible, it's impossible. But for example, I'm just making this up now, so this could be totally not work. But maybe we can move from a burning forging process to an electric forging process.
And we'll pay for it, government, because they can't be competitive otherwise.
Well, maybe it's not competitive now, but maybe it could be, and maybe it's a solar-powered electric forge. Anyway, what I'm saying is, and maybe there's a way, and you should talk about how you really did this with this a lot. So Pittsburgh, you can talk about the innovation that's happening in Pittsburgh right now. And what happens is the cities that actually figured this out, that forced the hard breakthrough to the next level, and then help get the cost curve down, have all of a sudden a competitive advantage.
Right. That's why when I say we would spend time trying to figure out if you could have both.
Right.
If you could have jobs in a good environment, and whether there's a technology breakthrough, which I can't answer whether in forging there is the opportunity to capture that, the fumes coming out of that. They're the real life examples that you're facing city in and city out of the battle about the kind of jobs we're going to have, okay? Whether you're going to, and jobs are changing, but there's still going to be jobs that are difficult jobs. Let me give you another example. Cities have garbage trucks. Where do those garbage trucks go to sleep? Nobody wants them next to their neighborhood. We have 400, 500 garbage trucks. Do you want them next to your neighborhood? So, but the reality is they need to go somewhere unless you have a complete circular recycling where you're picking up no garbage, but for the time being. They're the realities of it. There's good uses and bad uses, and how cities have to try to balance that. And that's a big challenge in the day-to-day managing of a city.
So there are European cities, by the way, Swedish cities, that have vacuum tubes. Where the garbage goes underground and these pneumatic pipes. And so they don't need garbage trucks.
Right.
But that's an enormous infrastructure investment.
Yeah.
And all the people who don't want garbage trucks still aren't going to pay for it.
Yes. I was thinking too about the issue of scale, as you were giving the example of the forging work. And you said that, you know, to a certain extent, this is a struggle that every city is facing. And so if that plant does decide to leave Pittsburgh and go to this fictional Texas city, then we're just shifting the problem, right? And so we haven't really addressed the potential for mitigating the environmental risks here. So I'm curious about how do we think locally, as you both have been talking about in the context of cities, but also forge alliance. I don't know, what does that look like to forge agreements or alliances that nobody's taking this kind of, right? Like,
so here's the good news. The good news is that Pittsburgh, as long as we're on the Pittsburgh case, has Carnegie Mellon University, which is an amazing engineering school and a very innovative and forward-thinking engineering school. And this is actually would be an interest. So partly what we're seeing is we're seeing that the cities that partner with their anchor institutions, and those are usually universities and healthcare systems, and the cities that partner with them the best are doing better. And so that's the kind of problem that you might bring to a Carnegie Mellon and say, can we really work on this? And then you want to go to a Department of Energy Innovation grant. And I mean, it takes leadership, and it's not easy, but it's worthwhile at least putting the effort to see if you can make it work. And if it can work, it can be a calling card for actually not only saving.
And I'll give you a real life example of this in Pittsburgh, exactly what he just said. There was an old steel mill site, 75 acres, that sat vacant because the city did a phase 1 environmental test on it, and they found 25 feet underground arsenic. And so nobody wanted to touch it. And so it just sat there. It's just less than a mile from downtown. Some bright young students from Carnegie Mellon University, and you could probably do this in New Haven, said, well, wait a minute, there's no arsenic used in steel making. And we ought to look, where's the arsenic coming from? And they do a class research project and realized that before there was a steel mill there 100 years ago, there was a gasification plant to make gas lights on the street. And it was a very narrow place on it was less than an acre on the 75 acres. And they identified where it was. They identified a way to get it dealt with. And if you go there today, there's a dozen or more buildings, technology buildings there now, including Carnegie Mellon University, on that site. And that was the city had sat on that property for 10 years. Or more after the mills had shut down, not wanting to move on it. That's the collaboration that Yale could bring. I mean, you have here and in other surrounding communities, huge amounts of brownfield sites that cities are probably reluctant to do things with because they're concerned about environmental stuff. And really, exactly what Jonathan said brings that intellectual rigor that a university can bring that can often solve the problem.
Can I give you another example?
a real world one?
Real world, yes.
Yes, please.
So there's so many. This one is Clemson University in South Carolina. In the 70s, created a PhD program in the computerization of carburetors. Okay. And they created the base, the intellectual capital, so that when Volkswagen and BMW and other companies started and Toyota said, we're going to build plants in America, and we need to find a place to build them, Clemson had the advanced technology on where engines were going, and it ends up, now there's a labor condition, a bunch of other things, but that was a key driver of bringing much of the foreign automobile manufacturing that's come to America has come as a cluster around Clemson. So,
yeah, I guess I'm hearing two things that I'm thinking about as you both are talking. One is that a lot of this requires time, right? And people have to be willing to slow down their decision making. I'm wondering how often is that possible, or how can we encourage people to slow down a little bit when so many of the challenges that are facing cities are really urgent, actually, right? Or they feel urgent. You don't think so? I
don't think I think you should never slow down.
Right. I agree.
Recognizing that this might take 10 or 20 years to make happen, but it happens only in that 10 or 20 years because every day somebody wakes up, is driving it, feels a sense of urgency about getting it done.
So I'm going to give you another example, which is Singapore. So Singapore is a city-state that was getting all of its water through a big pipe from Malaysia. And Singapore, and they had a 100-year lease on this pipe. And Singapore said, we don't want Malaysia to be able to control us by cutting off our water. So the lease went from 1960 approximately to 2060. So they said by 2060, we're going to become water independent. And this is something they began to work very seriously on, and they devised this thing they call the 4 Ts. So one is water conservation. And so the people in Singapore use 1/3 of the water that we do in America per person. They take showers every day and they drink coffee and they use water, but they use it much more carefully. They recycle their water, they use salt water. But the other thing they realized is that we need to capture rainwater and have in reservations. The issue is that it's a small island and there's not a lot of land for it. So they said, we want to increase the amount of land. So how are we going to do that? So they said, we need to take our real estate development. Also, there are currently a 4.5 million person population, and they want to get to 6 million people. So they said, here's what we have to do. We have to be denser and have taller buildings. That allows us to have more walkable, livable communities, less pollution because we have less car. That as we increase the density, we can afford a higher grade of subway system and mass transit. 12% of the island currently are roads. If we get that percentage of area coverage down to 8%, the 4% we say can be given back to biodiversity and be used to be these water reserves. So, and they're on a plan, so it's a 2060 vision. They're on track. They kind of know what they have to do every year to get there, to create the land, to preserve the water, So, and it's all tied together in a fantastic integrated scheme. So, number one, having the long-range vision. Number two, having, seeing how all the pieces tie together. Too often we say we're going to do one piece, but not another piece. And then, as Tom's saying, you're working on it every single day, because 2060 comes quicker than you think. But there's a series of, they've already figured out, to get the taller buildings, we need the transit, get the transit, we need this. They got all the, and that's what we need to do.
One of the things that you and I were talking about briefly as we were gathering in the room was, how do you pay for these things? I mean, so this sounds like a grand project with many moving parts, all of which are quite expensive.
Right.
And so I know that you've written about the issue of finance, but in a general sense, what are some of the creative techniques that people are using to pay for these projects?
So cities are sources of revenue besides tax structure. Cities have powers to bond revenue streams, whether it's, and the ability of a city to do that, to be sort of entrepreneurial, a public entrepreneurship attitude, in effect, gives a city enormous ability to raise capital. And if I could take a moment to describe Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh lost 60% of its population between 1970 and 1990. So we went from 650,000 people to, in 1990, 300,000 people. We were this manufacturing center of America, and then we were not. And we were in steep decline. We were the second oldest population in the country, not because people were retiring to Pittsburgh as they were to Dade County, which is the oldest population, because all of our young people were leaving. There were billboards in Pittsburgh saying, the last person out, shut the lights off. And so we are coming, so Pittsburgh's bond pension fund is 12% funded, and we're junk bond status. We make a decision, unless we invest in the future, we will be managing decline when I'm becoming mayor. And so we make very high-risk decisions about financing the future. We buy, for example, 1,500 acres of vacant steel mills, where no private developer in their right mind in a declining market was going to invest in an old industrial site. And we sort of said, who's going to be our partner to reimagine a different kind of city? And in that conversation, we recognized that we needed to be willing to share the risk with the Jonathans of the world, who had a vision of what cities could be, but couldn't get the financing to build housing or offices or whatever it was. And so we created a menu of financing options, okay? We reduced our workforce to create a development fund. We used tax increment financing, different kind of bond proceeds, and we really focused on it in a very intentional way and also in a very self-reliant way. We did not want to rely on federal or state money. We wanted to be able to be in the game with our own resources. So I believe that for cities to be successful, they need, in Pittsburgh's case, when it was really extreme, needed to have a really high-risk strategy. And it is politically very risky. Okay, to say, instead of hiring more police, I'm going to buy this old steel mill. And that decision, I think, is every city in the world now is trying to figure out its place in the world. And if they're not willing to take those risks to invest in the future, they're not going to get to the future. They're not going to position their cities well.
I want to build on that.
Please.
McKinsey says that there are 600 top cities in the world, which are the main economic drivers of the world. And in 2007, 360 of those cities were in the United States, Europe, and Japan. But as we see the rise of cities in Africa and Asia and South America, by 2025, far fewer will be in the developed countries. And in 2007, they said that 190 of those cities were in the United States. And by 2025, only 125 of the world's top 600 cities will be in the United States. So that means that 60 or 70 American cities are falling off the global map. So what Tom said was this takes big risk, it takes vision, it takes risk, and it takes guts. But you, as the leaders of cities, you have to say, what's my alternative if I don't? If I don't take a risk to redefine, to make my city more livable, more attractive, and more transformational for the lives of its residents. And so, for example, a city with a lousy public school system, whose children do not have who are not going to compete in the global world, so I'll tell you a quick story about that, is not going to be a healthy city. So, and one of the things I do in the book is I compare some pairs of cities. So in 1970, there was a national court decision about school integration, and that gave forth a lot of busing. So in Detroit, which at the time was 80% white and 20% black, the people revolted against the idea of busing. There's enormous white flight. The Ku Klux Klan, the John Birch Society burnt actually the school buses, and it's one of the many reasons, but that Detroit went to a vast decline, and today Detroit is 96% minority. Louisville, Kentucky said, okay, if this is what we got to do, then we're all in it together. They merged the city and the county school system, so you couldn't go to the county to get away from the school system. So that solved the white flight issue. And then what it meant is if we're all in it together, everybody had to make sure, and you didn't know where your kid was going to go, so therefore you wanted every school to be as good as it could be. And so there was an overall improvement in the whole school system. In many cities, there's a high school called the Manual High School, which is where manual trades are. It was for all the guys who weren't going to ever go to college. And they took the Manual High School, which is in the black neighborhood, and they made it a magnet school, and they made it one. So I visited Louisville, and I researched everything that's in the book. So one of the things they said to me is, Manual High School is now one of the 10 best high schools in America. And I thought, that's a lot of self-pride. I really appreciate that, but is it true? So I Googled it, and it's like, depending on the list, it's like between number 4 and 7. I mean, it has the number 1 most merit scholarships. It has a whole bunch of, it's like, it's really on the top 10 list. And so there are all these parents who want their kid, it may be better than Andover and Exeter. So there are all these parents who want their kid to go to Manual High School. And so And if they don't live near, and they don't want to live in that neighborhood, so they like the idea of busing to get their kid there. So they completely transformed the paradigm into one that said that we're all in it together. Now, here's the consequence of that. By educating these kids pretty well, I mean, it's not perfect, but by educating the kids pretty well, and by the kids growing up in a diverse and mixed race society, they are much better adapted to diversity. And the Louisville Chamber of Commerce has now used this as this marketing plan, which is come to Louisville because you'll have the most flexible, adaptable, collaborative workforce who are trained in the social skills needed in the 21st century. So that Louisville has actually one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country.
And its young people are sticking around.
Right.
Yeah. In this story, I think you mentioned in the 600 cities, I think you said the metric was the economic, those are the 600 cities that are the economic drivers.
Yeah.
And then you shifted throughout that story to talk about livability and social and sense of community. And in the book, you write about this tension between the drive for growth and for being, to position our cities as economic drivers, and at the same time, trying to design cities for compassion and for community and for trust. There's a long section on trust in the book. Often these things come into conflict, as they did in Detroit and in this, in many other examples. Can you both talk a little bit more about the places where that's a tension, but also are there ways to do both at the same time?
See, I actually don't believe they're in conflict at all.
You don't?
I believe they're in conflict. So first of all the stuff that we've been discussing about needs to be paid for.
Yeah.
So poverty is bad for everybody.
Yeah.
Economic growth, there's a point in which society overgrows, and we've overgrown our environmental capacity and all that. I deeply get that. But if you want to pay for new infrastructure, and you want to pay for better education, and if you want people to have livable wages, all that requires a healthy economy. And so that is, I believe, one of the preconditions. Now, they're all interdependent, so you need trust, you need all those other things, but as a city's economy improves, people's trust. So there's a very important concept in the health of communities called collective efficacy. Yeah. And collective efficacy means that we're working together, we can make a difference. But it also is dependent on the idea that you believe that working together, we can make a difference. So one of the big challenges, I think, when a mayor comes into a stagnant city is creating instant perception of momentum.
Let me piggyback. If I said General Electric, Motorola, Marriott, McDonald's, Caterpillar, and Google, and what would the common theme with all those be?
Pittsburgh, obviously.
Not Pittsburgh. No, not Pittsburgh. No. What's the common theme? This is important to you.
Innovation.
No, in the last 2 years, they've all moved their headquarters or research operations from cushy suburban communities, one in Connecticut, into cities. General Electric is moving their operations out of Connecticut into downtown Boston with very little parking from a campus. McDonald's is doing the same thing in Chicago. Why is that happening?
To attract new workers.
What's that?
To attract the workers.
Because they're going after workers. For the first time in history, we might be seeing a trend where always before people went to where the jobs are, we are now maybe beginning to see jobs follow talent, where talent wants to live. So if I want to get to McDonald's, which I did, I had to speak there for a ULI event, it required taking 2 subways and a taxi to get to their campus. It was a lovely campus in a lovely suburban community that did not permit any rental property. And so if I'm a young professional coming to work for McDonald's, that is a very unappealing place to live. One, I can't live there. And the other is if I want to live in the city where there's vibrancy. That is a real life That's corporations not making decisions out of the goodness of their hearts. They're making decisions because they're chasing talent. Virtually every city in America over the last 20 years have lost anywhere from 20 to 50% of their manufacturing jobs. So if you look at Baltimore, for example, Baltimore had twice as many manufacturing jobs in 1990 than they did working in education and healthcare. Now there's 3 times more jobs in education, healthcare, technical jobs in Baltimore than there is manufacturing. And so we have literally in the last 20, 25 years gone through a revolution of where people are working. And the value of that, of those cities that are going to succeed in that will be talent. And even as manufacturing comes back, which I think it will be driven by the availability of talent. And so that becomes a very important separator between cities that I'd be betting on that are going to succeed in the future and those that are going to be languishing because of the investments they make in education and also the presence of universities like Yale or Carnegie Mellon University or other places. That becomes a huge separation that you see happening in real time right now between cities, okay? And so the city's ability to educate people, and not to bore you about Pittsburgh, but we were in 1960 not in the 100 top cities in America for those with a high school education. You didn't need a high school education to work in a steel mill. Today we have the 3rd highest high school graduation rates of any city in America. But part of what we did, and this was done by the corporations, is that we created the Pittsburgh Promise, which says if you go to a Pittsburgh public school, you graduate with a B average, and you have good attendance, you get a $15,000 scholarship to go wherever you want to go. That's a commitment on our part of our community that recognizes how important education is. And it's raised all privately. And they've raised about $250 million. So that becomes a big piece of how cities begin to distinguish themselves. The availability and their ability to attract talent. And so that speaks to the jobs, but it also speaks to the livability, the quality of life of a city, that people want to live there because it's a great place.
So I have a livability story for you. Oklahoma City.
Right, great story.
So, I don't know, it was 15 years ago, the newly elected mayor, Mick Corbett, is that his name?
No, it was Humphreys at the time.
He opens Men's Health magazine. Are we telling the same story?
I don't know, go ahead. I know.
I think it's...
Nick Cornett is the mayor now.
Yeah, so anyway, opens Men's Health magazine, and there he sees on the cover, actually, it says the 5 fittest and fattest cities in America, and Oklahoma City was the fattest city in America. The guy goes, I didn't get elected mayor to become the mayor of the fattest city in America. How do I not be a fat city? It means people are too obese. So he asks his chief of staff. Chief of staff does some research, comes back and says, we got to be a walkable city. He says, what's that? We need sidewalks and street trees, and you need places for people to walk to, like a library downtown. So he does all this research, and they come up with a concept how to become a more walkable city, and he takes it to his people. Now remember, this is in a very conservative state, and they pass a sales tax increase to fund these improvements to become a walkable city. He hires the best landscape architects in America. I mean, there's no one that's the best, but very, very high quality. Does a beautiful job, builds this fantastic library, other cultural facilities downtown, beautiful sidewalks and street trees, plants trees, a park downtown, and people love it, and then they start walking more downtown, start beginning to get some more living downtown. Then the corporate leaders come to him and say, our kids are all graduating from high school and going to college and never coming back. They think this is such a boring place. And so we want our kids to take over our businesses and be here and stuff. So what can you do about that? So he does research and says, well, you need a loft district and an innovation district and a film and arts and all that stuff. And so again, they pass another bond issue and they create a film district and an arts district, innovation district, and nightclubs, and a whole plan. They change the zoning so that you can convert old manufacturing buildings into lofts, and that works. And then people come to him and say, you know, the traffic here is, you know, you're great. You put the city back on the map, but the traffic is so terrible. So research, what do we do about this? He passes another bond issue to do light rail. By the way, along the way, he restores the waterfront. One of the interesting things they say on the waterfront is, so what are we gonna do with this river? He goes, I'm gonna create, how can I like be globally competitive? I'm in like Oklahoma City. They create the world's greatest whitewater kayak Olympic competitive training system.
Yeah, they did.
Really?
They did.
Really?
And they hire some,
Man-made.
Wow.
and they hire like a Pritzker Prize winning amazing architect to design the kayak center. I mean, it's this beautiful advanced looking building and stuff. So everything he did with superb excellence delivered enormous value to the residents and in terms of livability. And so they kept voting for tax increases to pay for it.
What were the costs? I don't mean fiscal, I mean political. Whenever I hear these
The guy
stories, there
kept
must have
getting
been
reelected. It
opposition.
doesn't sound like their cost to me.
Well, I'm going to say, I'll tell you what the cost of any new idea. This, and I know Nick and the mayor before him is actually an active ULI member. Is the political cost is when Kirk Humphreys, who was the first mayor that did the first one, ran for the state U.S. Senate. He lost that election because he was seen as a spendthrift for getting people to vote to raise taxes. And there is, you can assume anytime you go into the public domain with a new idea, there are going to be at least 100 people there at a meeting giving you a reason why you can't do it. And you know, it's the wrong place, it's the wrong color, it's too big, it's too small, and there's never enough money. We don't want to pay for that. And can I do two more, which I think are great examples?
Sure.
So Denver is a good example. Denver in 2004, 7 counties in and around Denver, including Denver, and John Hickenlooper, who's now the governor, so he did okay, he was mayor at the time, says, you know, we're destroying the very reason we love Denver, which is the Front Range. We're polluting the death out of it. We're not going to see it in 20 more years because of the pollution. We need to build mass transit. And the voters voted to tax themselves to build a 120-mile transit system. And if you've been to Denver, the impact of that is, it can't be overstated. There's 78 stops. Half the stops have major transit-oriented developments, completely transformed, sort of sterile suburban communities. But the biggest one is in downtown Denver at Union Station, which was essentially an abandoned railroad station with 20 or 30 acres of vacant land or railroad land around it. There's $2 billion of investment there today. 3,500 apartments, millions of square feet of office retail. It really changed how people thought about Denver and how people use Denver and take advantage of it. The other one is in Cincinnati, where Cincinnati was losing their downtown in a neighborhood immediately adjacent to Cincinnati, downtown called Over the Rhine, which was viewed as the worst neighborhood in America. And the business had big companies like Procter & Gamble said, we're going to leave if we don't do something. Instead of them looking to the mayor, and there was a weak system, said, they raised $50 million, created a private organization called 3CDC, and went to the city and signed a contract that they would manage the development of downtown and Over the Rhine. The results have been nothing. I think it's the best development in America, okay? And they built 3 homeless shelters. They've done a lot of affordable housing as well as market rate housing, and have attracted a whole new generation of businesses downtown. So it's a really interesting story where we've talked a lot about mayors where the private sector has stood up and said, we care about our city and we need to make it work better than what it's working. And then in Denver, where there was a lot of political leadership that really drove so their city, it's really the intentionality, I think, and what Jonathan books touches on, I think, is that underlying leadership of sort of seeing this in a broad way and acting very intentionally.
I have to ask this question, and I realize then we'll open it up to folks. I don't know Cincinnati as well, but I know a number of students from Denver, and my own research has taken me there too. And there are a lot of people, there are certainly many wonderful things about these changes, but there are a lot of people who feel that they are being pushed out. Low-income people, immigrants, indigenous people who have long resided in Denver. I think we need to take that seriously. And yet,
Right.
you both have laid out the reasons why we have to create these more dense, walkable,
Right.
and yet there is a displacement effect, and there's also a sense of social and cultural displacement as well. So how do we grapple with that along the way?
So, I haven't been very involved in Denver since the beginning of this transformation in 1990, and interesting, when I raised the issue of affordable housing back then, most people said I was nuts because housing was so cheap, and I said, yeah, but if we succeed, it won't be so cheap. So, the city has just formed a housing trust fund. So, affordable housing, I'm going to step back. In the United States, there are 20 million families who spend more than 50% of their income on housing. And since poverty is actually greater in the suburbs than in cities, they're spending often more than 30% of their income on transportation, getting to and from work, et cetera, which is leaving them almost nothing left. The United States has about 2.3 million subsidized units of affordable housing, and we build about 60,000 new ones a year, which is less than we lose about 120,000 a year to gentrification and abandonment. So the supply is going negative. So it's an enormous problem that cities can do their best to solve, but the costs are so high, it must have federal and state resources also. One of the early smart things, so what happened was the group I'm very involved with, the national not-for-profit called Enterprise Community Partners, helped the formation of the Urban Land Conservancy, which is a community land trust, which has a mixture of public and private money to buy sites in the pathway of the light rail system, so that if they can buy land that's next to a future train stop, so that then that land is held by the land trust and will be developed as affordable housing. So that's one strategy. Another one is that cities need to zone. And they need to say that I believe that, so we hear too much about takings, about government takings, but there's a huge amount of government givings, and I never hear anybody use that phrase. So when government gives a light rail system, I believe that one should say that within X, a mile circumference or something of it, that all development within that must be 20, 30, 40, whatever, percent affordable. So that's part of the solution. That still won't, I should say one more thing. To solve affordable housing there's no one solution. It will require multiple solutions. And we should also recognize that affordable housing, the need is quite diverse. So there are young people just getting out of school. There are low-income seniors living on Social Security. There are people with severe mental instability who really need enormous supportive housing. There's a very wide range of need, and those require a wide range of solutions.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything to that?
I think this is a challenge that, if you look at both coasts, they've faced, Washington, New York, Boston. For cities now that are beginning to succeed, like the Indianapolises and Pittsburghs and Cincinnati's, it is a relatively new challenge, okay? And gentrification in some ways has become a bad word, but in many ways, if you can't get people with wealth to move to cities, if cities become only places where poor people live, cities will not succeed. You need to create that mixed income. And so at the end of the day, this is on cities to figure out. Federal government, since the time of Nixon, has largely, whether Democratic or Republican, the amount of money going into housing has largely and significantly dropped. Going into subsidizing, making housing affordable. States are, with tax credits, are generally, in some states, put a little bit of money in. So increasingly, the challenge for cities is to figure out how to manage this problem, and to the extent that they can get federal and state money. But it is to expand the supply. The cities need to make really very, very important decisions about how they're going to maintain affordable housing. If they don't, then they will lose control of the situation. I don't know if you're in the world. I mean, are you seeing that? I mean, I don't have any hope for the federal government and little hope for state governments to continue to provide or increase the amount of money going into affordable housing.
I actually,
Oh, God, I love your optimism.
so Denver, by the way, this fall passed a use of this of its income, of its tax. Basically, they created a $15 million fund to increase affordable housing. But
That's Denver. I'm talking about the federal and state.
I
Okay.
just want to complete on the Denver side. So on the federal side, interestingly, the number one tool for funding affordable housing is the low-income housing tax credit, which is a federal tax credit allocated by the states. It turns out is very popular with Republicans because it's a credit which companies take on their tax returns. It has 0 federal employees. There's no department of the low-income housing tax credit. So it costs, and it's incredibly efficient. So today, anyway, people actually, it's a very efficient tax credit. So in fact, in the tax bill that has been written, there's only 2 tax credits that have deep bipartisan support, and in this case, very strong Republican support, and that's the new market tax credits and the low-income housing tax credit.
I'm glad to hear that.
Furthermore, and this gets a little arcane, but in the way the tax code, if taxes go down, if corporate taxes go down, then the tax credit is worth less. And they're actually talking about adjusting it to make it worth more to compensate for the damage they will do with the tax reduction. So it's not.
Keep your fingers crossed.
But there's hope.
Can we open it up now to questions that folks might have in the audience? Anyone? Sarah?
Please state your name and where you're
My name is Sarah. I'm an undergrad at Yale. I think it's appropriate that I ask this question as a mix between private and public being very represented here. What is the limitations on public-private partnerships and what is their role in creating this city?
I'll jump in and you can agree or not. I'm a market believer. And so I don't like, for example, tax abatements, which if you build there, you get by right, whether you need it or not. So if Jonathan comes and says, we want to do a deal, I would say, and Jonathan will come and say, I have a great deal for you, Mayor. I would say, with all due respect, tell me why it's a great deal for you, and then we'll decide whether it's a great deal for us. And if it makes sense from the public good, then we'll figure out how to share the risk with you of doing that deal. That risk, sharing that risk is the public-private partnership. And that assumed, number one, we know what we want, what our vision is. If we don't know what we want, we're going to take his deal, maybe. But the other is understanding the market. If Jonathan comes and says, you know, I'm going to build on this old steel mill site, and I want to build housing, but I know you want a density and you don't want surface parking, and we need a parking garage at $25,000 a space, I can't afford to do that because I'm not going to get the rents that will support that. Can you help me with that space? That's a public-private partnership. We say, yeah, our vision is that we want that housing, or we want affordable housing, and it's going to cost Jonathan this much to build that house. He can get this much financed, and he's going to put this much in, and there's a gap. We will fill that gap if it meets our value. And then the next developer after Jonathan hits a home run, he leases up. The next developer in says, you know, I'll build more housing, I'd like that deal too. And we'd say, that deal doesn't exist anymore because the market shows that it will support this housing unless we're doing affordable housing, but if it's some other kind of housing. So I believe that cities need to be focused on what their market is and understand that the public-private partnership shares that risk where the market is not clear, or the market is not going to support something that the city wants to do that creates value for the city. So it could be, in our case, when we bought a steel mill site, we put a riverfront park in because we felt that would create huge value for the developments along it, okay? And I don't know, is that a fair statement of what I'm saying about the role the public-private plays?
So I view it differently.
Okay, well, that's good.
So because you've described it as two wary partners who are each trying to get the most out of each other.
No, you build a trust, though.
Right.
Yeah.
So I actually believe that having a common vision is essential, and having trust is essential, and that and transparency, and that I've seen fantastic things happen with public-private partnerships, and I've actually come to the conclusion that literally everything in a city is a public-private partnership. We just don't
agree
call
with
it,
it. Right.
because. And we actually need to figure out, to be more explicit about how we get these two realms to work together. I also believe that there are some goods that are purely public. So for example, parks, I think should be owned by the city. And I think that mass transit systems should be owned by the city. I mean, I think that there's a role for the commons that needs to be held as commons and not privatized.
I wonder if that was at the essence of your question about the limitations of the public-private. So some critiques that I commonly hear about this is that that the private element of this is more accountable to its shareholders than to the people of the city where it's doing its work. And so there's a concern about the degree to which that public-private partnership is accountable and democratically accessible to people who live and work in the city.
I absolutely believe that.
Yeah.
And I mean, believe your criticisms are correct. And so that's why I say there are public goods that, I'm a deep believer in the commons. Yeah. And there are elements of the commons that should not be privately owned. Mm-hmm. The other part that I just don't get is that when the public can do a tax-exempt bond issue for 3.5% or something like that today, and private investors are seeking for what they think is risk 15 or 17% returns, I don't get this idea that it's economically more cost-effective to have the private than the public.
Yeah, and there's sometimes hidden costs. Yes.
Hi, I'm Bobby. I'm a Yale 2010 grad and a future 2017 SOM grad. And I guess my question is, especially you as a former mayor of Pittsburgh, how do you help cities that need to do like full 180 industry shifts? I was born and raised in Atlantic City, and they've seen their monopoly on gambling just kind of evaporate.
Right.
So now they're stuck in a spot where they really need to bring in new jobs, but historically they've just always been oriented, casinos, and before that, kind of like entertainment, hospitality, they've all been out of favor for a while. How do you deal with cities like Atlantic City or like cities in the Midwest that need to bring in new jobs or find some new things?
I mean, the first thing I would want to understand, what are the competitive advantages of that city? Now, every city says we have a world-class hospital. You might have a great regional hospital. It's going to hire people. It's probably not going to drive a technology industry. So if I look at Atlantic City has some intrinsic value that they gave away for the casino. I went there as a young boy. It was a great family resort. And does it have the ability to attract that family resort back? Does it have the ability to attract, right at I guess across the bay, is there a big airfield there or something?
There's an airport, yes.
An airport. Is there an opportunity to attract some stuff there? I'm making some of this up, but I'd look at what your competitive advantages are today. I was asked to go to Atlantic City because Atlantic City was Pittsburgh. 60% of our employment was in steel, 60-70% of your employment was in gaming. It's the same thing. You had all your eggs in one basket, and that basket disappeared. And you needed to think about how to diversify your economy. My belief was that Atlantic City could begin to recreate itself more as a family resort. It still has the sort of the raw materials why millions of people went there, because of the ocean and because of the boardwalk, and it's not made that decision yet. I mean, this is where Jonathan's book, take a copy to the mayor and basically say this is about a leadership moment and about how do you begin to think about recreating a city that's failed. Atlantic City largely has failed. And it had a lot of money committed to it from New Jersey also. That was our challenge. I mean, we had to sort of look at what were our competitive advantages, and it wasn't obvious at the time that the universities were. The universities were, sort of enclosed, and they were hiring people, but there was not this whole idea of an entrepreneurial culture. We had to create that. And it didn't, we had the raw material. It was like we had coal in the ground, but we didn't have any infrastructure to take advantage of it. And we had to, in a very, very intentional way, with really great partnerships, create that structure to take advantage of that.
One thing you said about the state involvement and the point you made earlier about Pittsburgh wanting to do it itself, because of that state involvement, is that now Atlantic City doesn't own a lot of its real estate.
Right.
It's a public state board appointed by the governor.
Right.
It only lets the mayor join. 1 out of 20 of these regional directors is from the city. And so the state owns a lot of the land, and now the state actually manages the city to keep it from bankruptcy. And so there was a lot of, I think, foresight in what Pittsburgh did in trying to develop everything itself.
I mean, I believe, I mean, this is where my community organizing instincts come in, is that I believe deeply that people need to feel a sense of ownership of something. If I come in and impose it on them, so we spent lots of time in meetings, but we made decisions to move. Some people were happy with it, weren't. And it's that sense of ownership, I think, is so important for a city. What I saw in Atlantic City was that you had a state board that had money, but was sort of imposing a vision on Atlantic City that was not necessarily even the mayor or the elected officials, let alone the average person's vision of what Atlantic City ought to be.
The only other case I know of a state board imposing a vision on a city recently was Flint and its water problem.
Yeah, as a case in point.
Generally, those don't seem to work out so well.
One more, the sort of phone.
Sure.
I want to just give you a quick story that really, my wife and I were in the Peace Corps many years ago, and we lived in Paraguay, up the Paraguay River, a 3-day boat ride, right on the Brazilian border. We spoke Spanish, Brazil spoke Portuguese, and around us were some Indian tribes who spoke different languages. And I learned an enduring lesson that became really important when I became mayor. The lesson I learned there was the most powerful person in the town wasn't the one with all the guns or all the money, it was the person who spoke all the languages. And when we came back to the United States, we recognized that, and this is long before I ever thought I'd be mayor, but our society, by race, by class, by ethnic origin, by, if you work in computers, I have no idea what you're talking about half the time. We had language and culture differences, and that the most powerful person, I think, in American community were people I call translators that can and this was my biggest challenge as mayor, and I failed often, was how do you communicate in a city that's changing, in a society that's changing, that people see a place for themselves. They're willing to put up with a lot today if they see a place for themselves, down the line. And that's we have 500,000 people left Pittsburgh because they couldn't see a place for themselves. And every city has that challenge of how do you communicate that. So think about that as you don't get carried away with your own ideas. Think about how you are communicating, speaking that common language that people see that place for themselves in this city.
Hi, I'm Benji Rubenstein. I'm a joint degree with the architecture school and SOM. My question pertains to the formation of this vision for a city, because there are so many languages and so many people involved. And what do you think is the best way to come to a consensus on what this vision should be to include all the parties involved?
There's no one best way, but there are a variety of community-based planning processes that are off. So in the book, I described something called Envision Utah, which Peter Calthorpe led for Salt Lake City and the region, which is a very community-based process in which the bottom line is he said, here's all the growth that's happening. I've modeled it in these like little Lego pieces. Everybody gets to sit around the table, has a box, and you can design the region any way you want, but you got to put every piece on the board. And it forced people to confront the growth that came. Originally, they sprawled it all out. Then they realized that created all the traffic and issues they didn't like, because they did scenario analysis of each plan, and they began to cluster and cluster, and they came to realize that high density, mixed income, mixed use, transit connected development created the pattern of livability that they wanted the most. They didn't understand that in the beginning. The mayor of Boston is doing something now called Imagine Boston 2030, which is a community-based plan, a different kind of community-based planning process. So Envision Utah wasn't done by the government. It was done by a bunch of private citizens and companies. the Burnham plan for Chicago was actually done by private people. It wasn't done by the government. So we see both private leadership and we see government leadership, and they can both be valid.
Well, I'm thinking about sort of, in theory, you can go out to a group of citizens and say, this is what we want to do. This is our vision. And people will say, I love it, let's do it. And then when you begin to implement it, they will say, oh my God, I didn't know you meant that. And that is a very common that happens, is that it's very hard to get people to move from the conceptual to the, and you must have a lot of to the conceptual to the real. And that translation is very difficult to do. Okay, so I always assumed challenges. The other piece is that people are very focused on today. So the first thing I did when I became mayor over 6 months is have 90 meetings in 90 of the cities. There's 90 neighborhoods in Pittsburgh, and we had a meeting in every neighborhood. And we started, but what is it that makes your neighborhood the perfect neighborhood? It will make you happy. And people would come, thousands, 10 to 15,000 people showed up at these meetings in a city of 300,000. So a lot of people showed up. And it was fixing a pothole. It was cleaning vacant lots up. And for me, it was, and I understood that was important, but the purpose was to try to get them to think, in 5 years, where do they want their neighborhood to be? Do they want new housing, or do they want a supermarket, or what do they? And it was really hard to get people to envision the future. And so that'd be the two things of what is conceptual to what is the reality, and the other of visioning the future beyond the day-to-day is the big challenges when you begin to engage with citizens.
Yes.
My name is Ann. I'm a local environmental attorney, forestry school class of '76, and I have had the very good fortune to work on a number of successful public-private partnerships and a lot of brownfields projects. And one thing I've observed is that the larger municipalities have been better about embracing these projects and accepting risk than the small towns,
Right.
many of which have some of the same issues. So my question is, what recommendations do you have, particularly for those of us who live in small towns, to encourage those areas to accept risk, to try and redevelop some of these brownfields areas, to bring in affordable housing? How do you make this work on a small scale as well as the great success stories like Cincinnati, Pittsburgh?
Is there a particular town in Connecticut you're talking about?
I live in Newtown, but I work in a lot of small towns in the areas, and even with municipal or state statutes that are intended to protect these municipalities from liabilities, there's just a tremendous risk aversion. And so you see missed opportunities. And I thought,
so
what can you do?
It's an issue, and I have I have an office in Stamford, and we do a lot of work in Connecticut, and I don't have an answer to this. The reason why I'm hesitating is because there is in many of these towns kind of a cultural old boys network. There's there is a resistance to change, and Connecticut, I believe, is Connecticut now the third oldest state in America in terms of population?
I don't know the answer to that.
I think Connecticut has a dramatically aging population.
It's losing its young people.
It's losing its young people. If you go outside of Fairfield County and maybe New Haven, it's actually a state in pretty significant decline. And It's interesting, you often see when communities are in decline or in fear of decline, they cling to a past that they think was better rather than imagine a future. It is possible. Our company was, we used to have a planning group, we don't have anymore, but one of the last planning projects we did was in something to create what was called the Knowledge Corridor that went from Hartford to Springfield and the towns in between, and did a community-based visioning process to help them imagine what their future could be. And that was several years ago, and many of those towns are moving forward with those plans. So if you can bring in an outside but trusted group to, and typically these towns don't want to pay for it, so in that case it's paid for by state and federal funds, and have somebody else pay for it, that may help transform.
There's a publication I co-authored at ULI. You could get it off the website. It's called Reaching for the Future, Creative Financing for Smaller Communities. And it really attempts to address this because it is a problem I've seen nationally, is that a lot of the smaller communities are really getting left behind, and they have incredible assets. They have, great architecture down in their small downtowns often, and they're tearing the buildings down because they can't figure out today what to do with it. And so, or they have a big old factory that's sitting there vacant now for years and years because they can't figure out how to do that. Greenville would be, that's 100,000 people. South Carolina is a great example of a city that in a very intentional way decided to change its course and benefited greatly from Clemson, which is about 30 miles away. I think it's about education, and one thing that we have not mentioned explicitly that I think is really important in the conversation in this regard, because I find a lot of people resistant to public-private partnerships, is the ethics, the ethical structure of these things. If there's going to be a sense that I'm taking care of Jonathan because he's my buddy, and so I'm going to give him some deal with public money, then that will kill the conversation. And if it happens in a surrounding town, then that probably kills the conversation for everybody around there. So that's a big issue that needs to be sort of that transparency up front. You've mentioned that transparency. I think it's it's a non-starter otherwise. But I think it is getting, ULI has a district council, getting people to come and talk about this, and then maybe working through an old industrial site in one of these small towns about how you would do the financing. Cities and small towns have lots of financing tools at their disposal if they would choose to use them.
Can we take one more question? Oh, I'm sorry, yes. In the back, yes.
Hi, my name is Oni. I'm a social entrepreneurship fellow at the Center for Business and the Environment. First off, thank you all three of you guys. It's been super informative, and I really appreciate it. I just have a quick question on the role that arts and culture plays in community development in developing cities. I think it's something that's not easily quantifiable, but when we think about social cohesion, when we think about the importance of artists in these lofts that usually go and are the first movers in a lot of these areas that are soon to be gentrified, how do you really account for the need for that in a city?
So, can I start with a couple of things? So first, when I look at, we've described a lot of where work is going, where we look at the challenges of the 21st century. They actually require a different cognitive capacity than was required in the industrial age. And that is the capacity for symbolic thought, which is, which is really the essence of creativity. And it's not a linear kind of thinking, it's a whole systems kind of thinking. And we know neurologically that actually people who play music or the performance of art actually shifts the center of your brain into the neoprefrontal cortex, which is much more where this kind of thinking takes place. So I believe that arts has been, and culture has been held too much as an attractive flavor, as an entertainment capacity. And I actually think it unleashes a deep cognitive capacity necessary to thrive in the 21st century. And then for models, do you know the work of Theaster Gates in Chicago? Okay, so.
I pray to the Church of Theaster Gates.
Okay, so then you know what, and there are models like, he's exquisite, but there are models like that in many cities.
And let me just say, what I see in cities is that the idea of programming public spaces, which was an afterthought 10 or 15 years ago, now in many cities have now become a major operation for either cities or private organizations. And so you will see in Denver or Cincinnati or Pittsburgh where there is events almost every night of the week happening in a particular arts district that has created huge economic drivers for that area. It plays out in big real estate of apartments and condos, and so the arts and culture become a major economic driver to that. So that, I think, more and more cities are valuing that now. It's really been interesting to see.
Please join me in thanking Laura, Tom, and Jonathan. Now, everyone, for our live audience here, you get to do 3 important things. You get to have a drink, an appetizer downstairs. You can buy a copy of Jonathan's book, and you can continue the conversation that we started here. So please, down in the atrium on the first floor, everybody join us for refreshment, a little bit of food, and some more good conversation.